Mr. Chow, thank you so much for being with us and welcome on program. Let me talk about, for today's interview, let's speak about the future of energy, future of energy resources and how it can affect and what kind of effect it can have on the developing countries, on Caucasus region and stuff like that. This is, in summary, what we were going to talk about, what we're going to touch in our conversation. And let's, for the very beginning, for the very first question, let's talk about the trends, the main trends in the energy resources. What kind of tendencies, what kind of policies do we face right now, and what is the future vision about the energy resources?
Well, I think the biggest question in terms of global energy is how the world addresses climate change and the challenges it brings to us from an energy point of view. Today, more than 80% of energy consumed around the world is still using fossil fuels. That is primarily coal, oil, and gas. In spite of progress that's been made in popularizing renewable energy generation of electricity, the situation remains because the scale of energy consumption is so large and the legacy systems are so dominant that it will take a long time to shift from energy that emits greenhouse gases to non-emitting clean energy. I recommend to your audience to take a look at a publication that only came out last week by the International Energy Agency, which it's titled Net Zero by 2050. 2050 is the goal that developed world, that is OECD countries, have set for themselves in terms of arriving at net zero carbon emissions. And this publication by the IEA is they called it a roadmap of how to achieve net zero by 2050. Personally, I would not think of it as a roadmap. I would think of it more as a scenario of what it takes in order to achieve the political objectives that's been set out by the governments, at least of the industrialized world. And the challenge is quite daunting. So the question is, how do you change a big system, the energy system for the world, from 80% fossil fuels to close to zero fossil fuels, at least in terms of the use of fossil fuels without carbon storage and sequestration and other ways of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And I think the task is very daunting. It's like a little bit like turning a very large ship around. You can't do it overnight. Even 30 years from now is not too far away. So the question is, how do you reduce the world's energy consumption needs, shifting from coal, oil, and gas primarily to something that's cleaner and less carbon emitting? I think that's the biggest existential question the world is facing right now. There are lots of ideas, but no clear-cut pathway, I don't think, of how do we reach these goals, in spite of the IEA publication and the way they titled it. This will be a subject, of course, at the United Nations climate talks scheduled for Glasgow, Scotland in November. I think we will maybe get a little more solid indication from the governments involved how they hope to achieve these goals. But I would say that is by far the biggest question.
So let's talk a little bit about the alternatives to the fossil fuels. So the renewable energy, how much it is alternative, how much the resources of the renewable energy could substitute to fossil fuels for this time, for 30 years, or what could be the other options, or what could be the new innovations in that regard, what can substitute to that?
So again, this International Energy Agency report outlines what I would call a scenario of how to do this using scaling up existing technology we know about, even if they're not yet fully commercial, how to be able to use them to the full extent. But also, it will require technologies that we don't know about yet. So research and development in energy innovation in terms of new technology for either generating energy or the use of energy is going to be required in this IEA scenario as well. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. We can obviously use wind energy and solar energy. We can scale them up to a very large extent. We can provide government incentives for the private sector to do so. However, it doesn't really solve 100% of the problems of energy use, particularly for transportation, because as you know, the wind doesn't always blow and to help generate electricity, and the sun doesn't always shine, in spite of the fact that Georgia, of course, is a very sunny country.
Yeah.
So even if you can generate in total the electricity required and electrify transportation, automobiles, for example, there is a question of a problem of energy storage that needs to be solved. Large-scale energy storage, so that the fact that the wind may not be blowing or the sun may not be shining, the energy will still be available to the consumer to use for their electric cars, to heat or cool their homes, for industrial production. What are the issues, including industrial feedstock, petrochemical production, for example, is highly dependent on oil and gas. What would substitute for that? So this is what I mean about even if you can, mathematically plot a curve that shows that if you grow renewable energy by very high percentage every year, you can substitute totally for oil and gas. There are still challenges of how to use it properly. Are the electricity grids sufficiently robust to handle the new load that would be required? What about all the materials, rare earth materials, for example, that's necessary for electrification of the automobile fleet, of even on use in wind and solar energy. So there are a lot of challenges that we have to face, increasingly difficult challenges, as the percentage of renewable energy gets from 5-10% to 20% to over 40% to 100%. One of the things that the industrialized governments have decided, for example, and this is a correct decision, is if you're going to cut 100% of carbon emissions by 2050, then you need to do quite a lot in cutting emissions between now and 2030. In the next 10 years. You cannot wait until the last 20 years of the 30-year time span, because the easiest carbon reduction to be achieved you would expect would be in the first part. So you have to set a target of maybe 50% reduction between now and 2030 if you have any hope of getting close to net zero by 2050. The math is correct because the last carbon molecule will, of course, be the most difficult one to remove. But 10 years from now is just around the corner for the energy industry, where it requires large-scale capital investments to take 3 to 5 years to even implement a project, a large-scale project, and then a longer to make sure that you get a return on capital and so on. So the conditions almost need to be here today in order to reach the short to medium term goal next 10 years, and then the longer term goal in the next 30 years. I would submit to you that policymakers don't have all the answers yet. And meetings like the Glasgow meeting in November hopefully will help sort of concentrate the mind of policymakers of, given these ambitious targets, how do they plan to reach those goals? What are the policies required for implementing projects of such a scale as to reach it? I just don't see it yet, but this is a needed global discussion.
Actually, reducing the use of the fossil fuels, that means also the reducing the consumption of some kind, or changing the lifestyle of the population. What is the policy in that regard?
Well, this is, I'm sure you would not be shocked, Georgi, that this is the kind of subject that politicians don't like to talk about. Asking their voters to make sacrifices, that there will have to be sacrifices in lifestyles, for example. An American cannot just, get into his car, go to the filling station, buy cheap gasoline, and drive as far as often as he wants if we are going to meet these climate change goals. So this will be required, as you suggested, including lifestyle changes. But this is not. This is a conversation that really, I would say, haven't started yet. I mean, the other factor I think that is important to bring up is, of course, most of the carbon emissions, certainly on a per capita basis, most of the carbon emissions come from rich countries. There are a lot of poor countries around the world. The rich countries are also the ones who historically, in the last 200, 300 years, have been emitting the most carbon. So they have a historical responsibility as well as a current responsibility. There are over 1 billion people around the world who don't have regular access to electricity. Are we to deny those people a chance to develop? And if they do develop, which we hope that they will, and enjoy a higher standard of living, of course, they will be consuming more commercial energy as well. They'll be moving from, say, wood to burning commercial energy for their use. And so there's a question of equity as well. People, as an example, people talk about carbon emissions growing in China, which is true. But of course, China has a population about, in round numbers, more than 4 times that of the United States. The fact that China emits more carbon than the United States should not be a surprise to anybody. Chinese population on a per capita basis still consumes energy and emits carbon at a fraction of the per capita rate in the United States. So do the rich countries have to give up something in order for both historical and current equity, in order for developing countries to advance? And once they reach a certain level of economic development, as China has, then China too is investing. Actually, China is by far the largest investor in renewable energy in the world. But they can't do that when they start and they are poor. They have to consume energy in order to advance their societies. So I think it's a difficult question to resolve, and I hope that this is the kind of question that would lead to global cooperation rather than global competition or even conflict, or at least tensions, which on a bilateral basis, this is the way the U.S.-China relations is starting to look like, is that American politicians are saying, well, if we don't lead this revolution, then the Chinese will, and the energy revolution, the Chinese will. And instead of being friendly competitors, we see it in geopolitical terms, which I think is unfortunate and may not lead to the kind of result that we're hoping for.
This is also a very interesting question. You touched it right now in your answer, that the differences between the developed and developing countries. So if we have the challenges regarding the goal for the net zero emission for the 2050 in developed countries, how much developing countries can succeed with that for this time? And is it something like, let's say, that to jumping over the history somehow for the developing countries, jumping from the burning of woods towards clean energy at once?
I think that's a great point, actually. Is there an opportunity to leapfrog from burning wood to, and not go through, burning coal and oil and gas, and going to renewables as the predominant way, at least, of generating energy. The example that people often cite is that the developing world, in terms of telephone communications, because it was so costly and difficult to have landlines, went directly from no phones to mobile phones, right? And so they don't have to make those investments. I'm not sure how accurate that comparison is. Maybe there's some lessons to be learned from that. For example, distributed energy consumption or production, smaller scale solar. How do you make smaller scale solar energy commercially viable instead of needing always large scale projects using a centralized electricity grid? There are distributed energy production and consumption that can be implemented at a commercial scale. A lot of people are working on these questions, and I think they hold some promise. But I'm not sure that we can count on that to leapfrogging to take care of all the problems. It will require a new kind of thinking, and the current model is still that of large scale systems and with hardwired distribution of energy through electricity grids, pipelines, that sort of thing. And maybe the future will look somewhat differently. I think, to me, the first problem you need to solve in the developing world is to solve the problem of poverty.
Definitely.
And people need to have be able to have better income, enjoy a better standard of living, then they can pay for energy at a commercial at commercial rates. If they are poor, they will continue to suffer. And no, kind of the COVID pandemic has illustrated that to us, that poor people suffer more. I mean, it's a human tragedy. But the answer is, how do you develop societies so that people have better access to healthcare and that sort of thing. And all that requires economic development. And the lack of economic development is not going to solve the problem. As I said, it raises very, very large questions. The fact that the world wants to shift away from fossil fuels, that direction is clear.
So how can we develop these developing countries and kind of fight the poverty in these countries if we are reducing today the main source of energy for these countries and for their economies?
That's a really good question, Georgi. I have to say, if I have the answer to the question, maybe I should win the Nobel Prize for economics. You may have noticed that the G7 governments recently committed not to finance coal-fired power plants around the world, and I'm not sure that to tell a poor country that you can't use coal, you can't use particularly domestic coal, we're not going to help you generate electricity using coal. So therefore, you have to continue deforestation. You can, in order to cut wood down to make charcoal, and that's necessarily the right answer. So maybe providing them with technology that would generate electricity economically. Even using coal in a more environmentally responsible way is the answer, rather than kind of a blanket prohibition against financing coal projects. The Western countries, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, developed their economies by using coal. I mean, that was the basis of steam power. Coal was the means of getting, and as we got richer, we went to cleaner and in many ways more economic sources of energy. So if we have a different development path for the developing world, then maybe we should offer that, rather than cut off their means of developing their economy.
Definitely. So I would like to ask you about another sources of energy. So one is a clean energy, one is a renewable energy, but also we have the hydro energy, we have atomic energy, and so on and so on. So what is the future for that? What is the future for hydro energy? What is the future for the atomic energy? How much it could be developed in the nearest future to reduce the using of the fossil fuel?
I think there is still untapped potential in both areas. Certainly hydroelectricity, it can be somewhat controversial, as you know, in terms of where they are built, displacement of people, displacement of river flows. There are societal costs in addition to the fact that you can now use the dam, water from the dam to regulate the water flow for better irrigation, leading to higher agricultural production, as well as to generate hydroelectricity, of course. I think of a country like Georgia, and I haven't been in Georgia for a while, and certainly haven't worked in Georgia for a very long time, although I used to be active in the 1990s and the early 2000s. But clearly, this you have a country with ample potential resources of hydroelectricity. How do you tap that renewable source of energy in a responsible way, in a socially responsible and acceptable way? I think that is a challenge for governments to figure out and explain to the population and go forward. If there are still opportunities, and I suspect there are in Georgia, for even greater use of hydro electricity. Nuclear is probably less relevant for Georgia, but it is relevant for the rest of the world. Just to take an example, in the United States, for example, about 20% of our electricity is generated by nuclear power plants. A lot of those power plants will be aging. Their lives can be extended somewhat, but at some point they will need to be decommissioned. What's going to substitute for nuclear power? Would it be more natural gas, which of course will have a climate and carbon emission impact? Would renewable be able to step in at that point to take up 100% of the electricity that was previously generated by nuclear? I think there's a very active discussion going on in the European Union, for example, on whether nuclear should be counted as green energy or not. So far, they're not counting it as green energy. But a country like France, where a vast majority of electricity is generated by nuclear, will have something to say about that, it seems to me. The nuclear power industry around the world is in trouble because we have not been able to build large-scale nuclear power plants efficiently, safely, and without cost overruns and that sort of thing. And the financial risks are very high. The upfront costs are very high, even though they may be very economic if you take the total life cycle of the power plant over 40, 50 years. The economics look good, but the financial risks up front are very high, and we've had these problems. So there may be areas for innovation, technological advancement in those areas of nuclear. For example, there's much talk of small modular reactors, smaller scale nuclear power plants that is not as capital intensive and as time-consuming to build as the large-scale plants around the world, closer to the consumption centers, easier to distribute the energy and so on. So I expect that nuclear would be part of the solution. It's very hard for me to see how we are going to reach net zero carbon without nuclear playing some kind of role in energy production.
Another very important issue is for the global development is what would be with the countries, economies, which are really seriously dependent on the fossil fuel energy and resources. So there are two type of countries in that regard. One are the countries which are rich with the fossil fuel resources, and another are the transit countries. So what is the future of these kind of economies?
Well, I mean, you have two excellent examples of that in the South Caucasus, don't you? You have Azerbaijan, which has based its development in the 30 years past after the collapse of the Soviet Union, very much on the development of oil and gas, and the age of oil and gas may be coming to an end. Even if we see it as a very kind of slow glide path of decline of total global consumption of oil and gas, the prospect is out there. So the need to diversify away from oil and gas, continue to produce oil and gas that is economic and so on, but working on diversification of economies such as Azerbaijan, and by no means the only country with that challenge, is more, that requirement is more urgent today than it was 10, 15 years ago. I think that much is clear. For Georgia, Georgia, of course, is not a fossil fuel producing country to speak of, but has been an important transit country. And Georgia has been able to play a role in transit of Caspian oil and gas that's very beneficial, has been, for not only Georgia, but for the world in the last 20 years. The question is, what is the role, that future role, going to be? And that's going to likely to be declining. I mean, but Georgia will therefore have to rely on its other natural resources, including human resources, for its economy, which Georgia is already doing in terms of upgrading agriculture exports, including Georgian wine, which I'm very fond of, tourism, IT, and other areas that you would have to look at for future economic growth. The transit role will become less and less important economically. There's also, of course, a geopolitical element in that Georgia will have to make itself important to the world in different ways than being mainly a oil and gas transit country. That is going to be less and less important to the world. Long pipelines, such as Baku-Ceyhan, the gas pipeline, the South Caucasus gas pipeline, that connects now to TANAP and TAP, taking Azeri gas all the way to the European market. Those will become more and more scarce over time. That very long distance transport of oil and gas at a time when demand for oil and gas may be declining in the long run, we're probably going to see fewer and fewer opportunities for that. So Georgia will have to have a different story to tell than just being that's not fair. Georgia is a lot of things, but it's also a transit country. And that's one way it has been getting international attention. And there are better, longer-lasting ways, I'm sure, for Georgia to play an important role in the world. And its geography will still be important. I mean, its geography connecting Asia and Europe,
yes,
will still be important. Even if the goods being transported are not oil and gas.
That was my question, actually. I would like to ask you about how much this transit from the Asia to Europe and on the other hand from the Europe to Asia could substitute the oil and gas transit in the nearest future?
Well, you can almost think of it as an extension, right? I mean, the fact that Georgia has been successful in being a transit country for oil and gas is a proof of concept that Georgia has sufficient political stability to be a reliable energy. It's part of a reliable energy corridor, means that it can be a corridor for other things. And so, you know, I would see it more as a continuation almost than as a substitute. That it kind of expands the scope of Georgia's role rather than to limit it to oil and gas. And the other part is, you know, not just be a transit country, but how do you capture some of the economic value generated by the transit because of your geographic advantage and proximity to both Europe and a economically expanding Asia. So you know, I guess I see it as a continuation.
So, Mr. Chow, for the ending of our interview, I would like to ask you how much. Let's go back to the net zero point for the net zero goal of the reducing the using of the fossil fuels. So, how much depletion of the fossil fuels is in what regards the depletion of the fossil fuels is the reason for this decision?
I would say almost zero. You know, I think, you know, in the history of mankind, we have seen human ingenuity tap into more and more natural resources in a economically efficient way. The latest example I would remind your audience is the American shale oil and gas revolution. So it proves that we can drill deeper, use technology, including IT, to direct the drill bit, drill horizontally, inject inject water, sand, and other special chemicals in order to unlock the oil and gas deeper into the earth crust. So I don't see natural resources as being the limitation. You know, every time we went from coal to oil to gas, we went to a cleaner, more abundant, cheaper source of energy, actually. And therefore it became available to more and more people. I'm hoping, and I'm almost trusting, that human ingenuity, innovation will do the same on green energy. How precisely, I cannot tell you. I can tell you that it will take a bit of time, that it's not something that can be done in 2 or 3 years. Definitely it will require 2 or 3 decades, even maybe more. But the availability of natural resource is not the problem. The problem we're facing today is how do we generate energy responsibly, given the climate challenge that the world faces with rising sea levels and extreme weather that may be caused by climate change or not, depending on your point of view. But it seems clear that we need to mitigate some of the effects of the use of fossil fuels, in addition to planning and acting on how do we lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. Net zero is a nice target to have, but no, whether we'll ever get there or not, well, I don't think I'm going to see the end of fossil fuels, given that I'm an old man. But I'm very optimistic that my children and grandchildren will.
When we have at the pre-interview, we were talking about this issue, and I would like to ask you for the ending that if there are a lot of challenges towards the net zero goal, and what is their plan B?
I think this is something we need to have, and mitigating the impact of climate change, I think is needs to be considered in combination with the ambitious goal of limiting carbon emissions that our political leaders have set. I truly believe that it would be irresponsible not to have a plan B as well. That's not the way the governments are talking for the moment. But I think at some point reality would hit that we cannot sort of count on a silver bullet to solve all the problems. We may want to plan for some contingency as well. We're not there yet, but I feel that this is a discussion that we need to have. What I'm afraid of is reports such as the IEA report of net zero by 2050, a roadmap. It paints a picture that is so daunting that in terms of the challenges and tasks required in order to reach that ambitious goal, that it becomes divisive rather than getting people together to work towards net zero and clean energy. There will be people on one extreme that say, you see what we need to do, we need to stop all internal combustion cars tomorrow in order to lead to net zero. And then there are people on the other extremes as well. What they're demanding is impossible, so let's not even think about it. Let's just keep on going the way we are. Somewhere in the middle that has a plan A, B, and maybe C, D, and E is necessary for us to have a balanced strategy for the future of the human race on Earth. And we're very far from that conversation. But at least in the United States, we now have a government to take that considers the challenges seriously and is willing to join in the global conversation, dialogue about it in order to try to reach some consensus. And that's an improvement over the previous 4 years, it seems to me. I just hope that this is the kind of issue that will lead to the world coming together rather than the world fighting over who gets to consume what amount of carbon emissions and so on, at the disadvantage of the weakest and poorest countries in the world.
Mr. Chow, thank you so much for this time. And is there anything you would like to share with us, anything more?
Well, I hope one day that the travel restrictions will be lifted and I'll be able to visit Georgia again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wish you good luck and wish you health.
Thanks, Georgi.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.